We are going to be talking today about uncertainty and the multiplicity of planetary futures. It's a great panel with very interesting people. And basically, the main ideas of this panel might be condensed to three. First, where does the Plantationocene fit in terms of a number of different scenes now in our intellectual landscape? What kind of future does it suggest for us all? Maybe a second overarching theme is, what are the structures of dispossession, past, present, and future that this implies? And possibly a third overarching theme is, how does capitalism drive the Plantationocene as an idea and as a structural reality? And to help us think about that, all of these different points, we have a really terrific panel. And I'm going to just tell you about all of them up front, just in case my internet condition goes out, because as soon as spring hits Ithaca, of course, it starts to snow. So I'm praying that my internet is going to hold out. But we have some terrific speakers. First, we're going to have Kasia Paprocki, who's an assistant professor of geography and environment at the London School of Economics. She'll be talking about climate change adaptation in the Plantationocene and how it shapes the adaptation regime, with its focus on climate change adaptation as the cure for economic underdevelopment. Then we're going to have a team panel of Andrew Curley, who's assistant professor of geography at the University of Arizona, and Sara Smith, who's an associate professor of geography at UNC Chapel Hill. They'll be talking about the ways that geography has been grappling with the proliferation of scenes over the past decade: the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, and the Plantationocene. From there, we'll move to Sharad Chari, associate professor of geography, also at Berkeley, speak on an ignored act of subaltern political will from post-plantation Durban, an occupation of space that produced nothing less than the slave plot writ large over an entire city. And from there, we'll go to Cornell, to Phil McMichael, who's a professor of global development here in Ithaca, and he'll talk about the concept of dispossession by accumulation and how it reformulates the Plantationocene as an intensifying ontological crisis, where land commodification accelerates time by space. From there, we'll go to Brazil, to Judite Stronzake, professor of education at the Universidade Federal de Grão-Dourados. She's going to be talking about the maintenance of the colonial productive structure in Latin America, with its dependence on export markets and the permanence of an export-oriented agriculture based in large monocrop plantations. And finally, we'll end back in Berkeley with Michael Watts, Chancellor's Professor of Geography Emeritus and co-director of development studies there, who will talk about the Plantationocene as a way of linking the contemporary agrarian question with new work on extended extraction, the planetary mine, and the operations of capital. And I would just want to remind everybody that the panelists have 10 minutes each. When we're getting towards 10 minutes, I'm going to hold up these ominous homemade signs of 2 minutes and 1 minute, made by my child, no longer a baby, but slightly beyond that. And also, we ask folks to please stay muted during the presentations. You can raise your hand and we'll try to, at the end of the presentations, we'll try to call on you, and the Einaudi folks will bring you to the center of the screen. It might even be better to just write into the chat, because then we can keep those for afterwards, since all of this is being recorded. So if you want to write your question into the chat, we'll make sure to get it off to folks. So, but without any further ado, let's start with Kasia Paprocki, again, assistant professor of geography and environment at the London School of Economics.
Great, thanks so much, Eric. I do have slides I'm going to share. So, yeah, thanks again to Eric for organizing us, and to Wendy and the rest of the organizers for such a great program. I've really been enjoying the conversations, and I'm especially looking forward to our discussion today. So, all right, I will get started. Okay, so understanding the current epoch as the Plantationocene has told us a lot about how plantation logics have been responsible for devastating transformations of the planet, including climate change. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is how these plantation logics also shape the way we choose to live with these transformations. And what I think is really powerful about thinking with the Plantationocene concept is that it draws attention to how the impacts and experience of climate change are differentiated by an uneven global political economy as a set of social relations and an imperative and an ideal, in Wendy's words, The plantation also shapes the governance of life in the face of climate change. So because the topic of this panel is the multiplicity of planetary futures, I'll start from the premise that there are multiple possible futures, that none of them are inevitable, and that decisions are being made actively in the present to shape those futures, both materially and epistemically. Now, while this premise may sound at first like a truism, it's in fact at odds with many visions of planetary futures as understood by discussions of the Anthropocene. Now, as several other scholars have observed about discourses of the Anthropocene, they suggest a kind of inevitability and universality of the impacts and experience of climate change, divorced from the particular dynamics through which they transpire, the power structures that mediate them, and the diverse histories and ecologies they intervene in. As Anna Singh has written, this anthropo blocks attention to patchy landscapes, multiple temporalities, and shifting assemblages of humans and non-humans. And one place where this teleological thinking about climate change is particularly stark is Bangladesh, a country often described as the most vulnerable country to climate change, where some accounts like ones illustrated in this animation predict the entire coastal region being wiped off the map, displacing millions. And while I don't have time today to get into the politics of uncertainty about these particular environmental changes, what I do want to highlight is how these teleologies are manifested in projects collectively referred to as climate change adaptation. Specifically, what I'm talking about here is a mode of governance that I refer to in a forthcoming book as an adaptation regime. This adaptation regime is not an inevitable response to climate change. Rather, it is a response to climate change that is shaped specifically by plantation logics. Briefly, the adaptation regime is a socially and historically specific configuration of power involving both material and epistemic elements, both a set of practices and a normative orientation to the future. It shapes the way the landscape is understood and managed. It encompasses the scope of particular development activities considered suitable for climate change adaptation. It disciplines understandings of the futures and livelihood strategies which are seen as viable now and in the future, and it facilitates accumulation. And it does this in particular through a vision of a transition away from agrarian livelihoods toward urban export-oriented production and the radical transformation and dispossession of rural communities. All right, so with that groundwork laid, I'd like to briefly sketch for you 3 key propositions about how this adaptation regime is shaped by plantation logics. Collectively, these propositions suggest that understanding the current era as the Plantationocene tells us more about the production and experience of climate change than the Anthropocene or otherwise. So first proposition, adaptation in the Plantationocene generalizes plantation logics through spatially uneven frontiers. Even as plantations generalize a certain rationally ordered maximization of productivity, they do so in uneven ways within and between communities. Plantations, as Edward Thompson wrote in his classic of historical sociology, The Plantation, are tools of frontier making, and those frontiers are governed differently from their metropoles. Adaptation in the Plantationocene abides these same logics. So for example, visions of adaptation look quite different in New York City than they do in Bangladesh, and the maximization of productivity in each is contingent precisely on this unevenness. So visions for adaptive defense of New York City are just as dependent on this seawall that you can see on the left as they are on the expansion of dystopic plantation frontiers like this one in Bangladesh on the right. The ways adaptation is practiced in particular places are shaped by global visions of production and social reproduction on a changing planet, even as they are also particular to individual places and their histories. That means it's necessary to see these 2 examples not as discrete cases of adaptation, but as mutually constituting nodes in a larger global political economy. And any fans of Phil's joining us this morning might recognize this as an insight gleaned through incorporated comparison. Second proposition, dispossession is a key tool of adaptation in the Plantationocene. Plantations have always relied on dispossession of humans and non-humans to reshape landscapes, whether through the global traffic of slave labor or the displacement of indigenous plant life. As Wendy wrote in her article, the plantation simplifies landscapes by removing original plants, animals, and people and replacing them with workers and cash crops. We have seen that measures for climate change mitigation drive agrarian dispossession, such as through land grabbing motivated by the global expansion of plantations for biofuels and flex crops. The adaptation regime also governs production and social reproduction through the dispossession of individuals and communities who are superfluous to value extraction in newly adapted ecologies. This can manifest as what is often called climate migration, as well as more mundane forms of dispossession, such as the displacement of agrarian communities from coastal regions threatened by sea level rise as they make way for new forms of production, such as shrimp aquaculture, like we saw in the last slide. And finally, my third proposition, adaptation in the Plantationocene is a tool of racialization and of the governance of racialized bodies. Now, obviously, this builds on some of the conversations that we were having yesterday, and I would be particularly interested in hearing Nancy comment on how this sort of builds on the ideas that she discussed in her presentation. As I've already said, the political economy of adaptation shapes how individuals and communities experience climate change in uneven ways. And in doing so, it sorts the subjects of adaptation into winners and losers. And while some have drawn attention to the more than human politics of the Anthropocene, attending to the racializing logics of the Plantationocene allows us to see that the category of human itself is unsettled in a world where some are determined to be worthy of protection, while others are displaced to facilitate new kinds of extraction. These biopolitics of adaptation allow for the selective protection of certain bodies while subjecting others to acute risks. Thus, we can imagine a seawall wrapping around the coast of Manhattan, protecting the inhabitants of Wall Street, while simultaneously imagining Bangladesh's coastline being entirely inundated, displacing millions. And for the record, this image on the left is an official rendering of New York's seawall by the architecture firm that designed it. It's no wonder then that we find that resistance to this adaptation regime is often manifested precisely in the rejection of plantation logics and the forms of production and social reproduction associated with it. June and Jennifer Franco have similarly identified these possibilities for land-based social reform as agrarian climate justice. In Bangladesh, for example, some agrarian social movements have rejected the industrial aquaculture plantations expanding under the adaptation regime in favor of a return to small-scale peasant agricultural production. The resistance of this movement and others like it suggests an alternative model for climate justice in the Plantationocene. So then, just to conclude very briefly, these three propositions suggest that it's more useful to understand the plantation as a set of technologies and social relations rather than as a space. As Wendy's article usefully draws our attention to, understanding our current era as the Plantationocene opens up possibilities for interrogating these technologies as well as resisting them. Understood as a set of technologies that are practiced in the present and which can be resisted, we can see that there are multiple possible futures, none of which are inevitable. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kasia. For our next presentation, we have a dual presenting team, Andrew Curley, Assistant Professor of Geography at the University of Arizona, and Sara Smith, Associate Professor of Geography at UNC Chapel Hill.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Wendy and Andrew, for organizing and the invitation. This paper that Sara and I are writing is actually in response to the questions of scenes, and more in response to the time and the temporalities implied in scenes than the logics of them. But including a question of the logic. So we have a lot to talk about and read, so I'm just going to get into it. Climate change is an anxious pair of words. These words resonate in visceral ways in fractured political environments and speaking to planetary crisis in the new and immediate future. Geologists, geographers, and social scientists have done their best to contextualize the moment, and following the lead of geologists, have debated timescales of epochs, most notably the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and Plantationocene, what we're referring to as the scene. In 2013, Curley witnessed the painting of a mural in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, that told a story about climate colonialism and the built environment. The mural was titled Water Rights, W-R-I-T-E-S, and was sponsored by an Oakland-based NGO to convey the politics of water in the Southwest. The mural told the history of Arizona, working aesthetically to put notions of good and bad in the same plane, within the same time, and balance extractive and renewable technologies. Centered was Mother Earth, pregnant with Dene warrior twins, against the backdrop of Tohono O'odham First Man Basket. On the left-hand side of the mural was exploitation of Navajo water and coal for the development of Phoenix. On the right side was traditional indigenous farming and herding alongside renewable energy technologies like solar and wind. This mural put past and future, balance and exploitation, place and thought in the same space. This was not a story of scenes, but of past and possibilities rooted in indigenous understandings of trauma and survival. The mural was painted at the same time the Navajo Nation was considering the renewal for a lease of a 50-year-old coal-fired power plant. Now, another type of a mural surrounding the Navajo Nation Council has a very different kind of understanding of time. Painted as New Deal art in the 1940s, the mural tells the story of Euro-American colonization, progress, and the advancement of modernity in the Navajo Nation. In this linear retelling of Arizona history, the colonizer brings benefit and erases traditional economies, replacing them with formal education, monoculture agriculture, and wage labor jobs. These are two different environmental narratives. The 2013 mural reflects new interpretations of indigenous political philosophies of the environment, and it contains an ontological understanding of place and time that spatially combines elements of positive, negative, past, and the future. But in the second mural, history is linear, bad elements remain in the past, and good is in the future. This tells time in a very different way. It centers Euro-American intervention and Eurocentric notions of history, time, and the future. The differences in these murals for us recall the promises and erasures in theorizations of human history in relation to environmental change. So I think this is Sarah's section.
Why are Black and Indigenous people so often depicted as scenery and plot devices rather than foregrounding the theories and actions through which they have worked to understand our current condition? Alexander Wahelier tells us that white men are empowered to theorize for the world, while Black, and we add Indigenous people, who have embodied experience of ontological violence are ethnographically detained. That is, they're made to speak only to their people, not for the world. People do tricks with time in order to claim and to bound territory. How does anticipation of the future animate our relations to one another? Narratives of climate crisis and the drive to theorize it risk creating new forms of land grabs. A theoretical one, in which European-derived theory colonizes our understanding of global ecological change, while in a parallel move, white climate policy overwrites other visions of environmental action. In both cases, urgent action could also entail running roughshod over Native sovereignty. In policy and in the academic readings of the planet, time does political work, but the long enduring work of Black and Native people fighting for freedom gets erased. What if we were to center demands that Black and Indigenous people have been making rather than reconstruct white history and rely on its logic to save the world? The Combahee River Collective's 1977 statement, they ask us, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since their freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. How can we avoid succumbing to an essentially white apocalypse, one that only acknowledges disaster when it comes for white people? We appreciate Janae Davis's 2019 et al. 2019 Compass article, in which they point out that the Black people working on the plantation are in some formulations of the plantationist scene relegated to the footnotes, while modern agriculture gets described as the slavery of plants. Potawatomi scholar Kyle White writes, Indigenous people do not always share the same science fiction imaginaries of dystopian or apocalyptic futures when they confront the possibility of a climate crisis, because their ancestors were already living in a dystopian future. We do need a critique of colonialism and plantation and the Anthropocene, but not one that centers Western history. Temporal concepts are also political orientations. For White, crucially, that doesn't mean reifying or fixing ancestors in time, but rather placing their practices and political systems alongside those of today to provide a means to understand what is required now. Scholars like Jody Bird, Christina Sharp, Kyle White, Zoe Todd, and many others tell us stories about time and power and global rupture and breaking points, but the politics of their stories have a different orientation. That's not about bounding time, but about generating ethical imperatives toward work in the present. In thinking about and responding to global environmental change, we attend to the already existing scholarship drawing on Black and Indigenous thought, which we find, 1, questions the human-nature divide naturalized in seen thinking, 2, centers place-based and embodied relations to the environment, 3, disrupts progress narratives and linear time, and finally, and maybe most importantly, suggests abolition, decolonization, or anti-colonial oriented projects, rather than proffering technical solutions to political problems. These are spatial and temporal disruptions to the linear and Eurocentric scene.
Some of the implications of this are felt in the Western states. When settlers entered the West, they saw desert. To the hundreds of indigenous nations and thousands of communities, the ideas of deserts were not only how colonizers understood their environment, but how they acted upon it. The colonists coming from the East and Europe before that had built cultural practices around the use of resources that were exploitative and exhausting. Animals were killed to extinction, forests were felled, waterways diverted, and the earth mined for coal. The diverse ecological areas of what would become Arizona demonstrate how environment and notions of time, progress, and modernity were core to the making of colonial landscapes. Yet both peoples were looking at the same places, but they had different historical experiences and different ontological framings, as we've mentioned. Settler colonialism didn't just extinguish Aboriginal title, it erased centuries of historical relationships between people and the environment. It pretended people weren't there and nature was for the remaking. It both erased Indigenous life and made the possibility of new racial hierarchies possible. Much like the Black body in the minds of the enslaver, the land was made fungible, empty space on which colonial futures might be constructed. Today, water is measured on imperfect colonial cycles, such as annual flow according to the calendar year, and acre feet that are flooded to 1 foot of water that then is quantified and distributed between the 7 Colorado Basin states, ignoring indigenous uses of rights to water and building up dams and diversions such as a Hoover Dam on these assumptions. So I'll just cut to the conclusion, and this is going to be future work that is going to be part of a forthcoming paper with the looking at water in the West. So the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and Plantationocene insert European colonization into planetary and geological history. But theorizations and policies centering European history and agency seek to speak to and protect humanity in the face of global environmental catastrophe, risk derailing and distracting from existing claims and practices for decolonization. That's existing claims to practices and decolonization. These already contain possibilities for environmental stewardship, and these theories become, in our minds, anemic and result in technocratic solutions, legacies of Malthusian scarcity and eugenics programs, and even underwrite new security measures that generate and replicate old patterns of violence. So finally, as we consider and conclude this work that is done by narratives of scenes, we might do well to keep this question centered. What future is enabled for Indigenous peoples and knowledge when we understand all of time through these lenses? Can we follow scholars like Eve Tuck and also Menunez by framing time not through only past trauma, but through a horizon inflected by desire and with desire? What does this enable for our politics and for our policy? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew and Sarah. From here, we're going to move on to Phil McMichael from Cornell. Again, he's a professor of global development here in Ithaca.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for organizing this incredible conference. So the first thing I'd like to say is that this fall, the United Nations is staging a food systems summit organized under the auspices of the World Economic Forum of all people, representing the 1,000 largest corporations in the world, and inspired by its founder, Klaus Schwab, who claims that, quote, corporations are the trustees of society, unquote. And I think this is a telling example of the plantational scene as a discursive ideal at work, busy suppressing the agrarian voices involved with food sovereignty movements and ecological farming. So that's just my introduction. So I wanted to talk about the plantational scene as a representative of the paradigmatic structuring of modernity. But I would encourage, a little bit like Sarah and Andrew, I would encourage a broader historical method to capture what is lost in consequence. Instead of theorizing this maturing paradigm, often captured in the phrase accumulation by dispossession, I suggest reformulation in terms of dispossession by accumulation. Such reformulation enables a focus from charting the development of capitalism as the unfolding at scale of the plantation model as a material and discursive ideal, to include articulating the dissipating and destructive effects of capital accumulation. That is, while analyzing the pattern of capital accumulation, it's essential to equally focus on what is devalued, marginalized, and/or excluded. This is not only a relational issue, but it also involves reckoning with extant old and new ecological practices across the world, but invisibilized by the dominant paradigm. And this is not just about material dispossession, it's also about accumulating erasure via self-fulfilling narratives represented these days as technical and epistemic lock-in. It is relational and deeply historical in the sense that it informs what today's world continues to progressively extinguish, where it comes from, and how it is sustained epistemically. So, this phrasing, dispossession by accumulation, would reformulate a geological timescale like the plantational scene as an intensifying ontological crisis where commodification of land compresses time by space in the sense that the globalization of the so-called plantation model accelerates collapsing Earth systems, including the destruction. Sorry, I'm just trying to set up my screen here. Including the destruction of landscape or cultural knowledges shared locally rather than globally digitalized. In this sense, the paradigmatic fetishism of the plantation model masks or discounts the destruction of life worlds, from indigenous cultures through to artificially connected modes of rural and urban life. So just taking in this kind of data, I think is very important. And then the kind of distancing of the satellite imagery that the World Bank uses to create land registries and identify land for investment. This was a ad in an airport I happened to capture a few years ago, which tells you something about this kind of distancing of global investment in the landscapes. And finally, Argentina's soy boom and Amalia Guzman's terrific new book, Seeds of Power, where she's talking about farmed pampas being farmed from a distance with the aid of satellites and high-tech instruments by professionals and entrepreneurs who farm from the comfort of urban settings and IT offices, representing the transcendence of the urban-rural divide by the modernization of the countryside. So note, it's one thing to integrate historic racism stemming from enslavement. It's another to extend this relationship to the dispossession of original African life worlds as paradigmatic of capital's history. The commodification of African labor was integral to capital accumulation on New World plantations, but it was premised on deeper effects. Thus, how to make reparations for compromising the futures of so many peoples since the early plantation systems emerged. And looking back to look forward underscores how the progressive undermining of species life on planet Earth, from worms to plants to factory farmed animals, via proliferating commodification, invokes what I would call the method of unmasking commodity fetishism as a historical method of problematizing phenomenal forms of capitalist modernity by reconstructing the complex relations producing and reproducing them, including dominant narratives such as, quote, the development of capitalism. Okay, so here's this brilliant cartoon. If you stop and think about it, is this guy conscious of commodity fetishism, given what he's saying to the starving global south, so to speak? The other point here is that I want to argue that fetishism is both a cause and an effect. And the effect seems to me that this guy is claiming that he's busy saving the planet, and he's oblivious to what else is going on with biofuels, etc. So this enables attention to those life worlds that are eliminated or adulterated. A recent example is the reconstruction of Aboriginal ecologies of social reproduction. Bruce Pascoe, an Aboriginal intellectual in Australia, has just produced this book, Dark Emu, Black Seeds, Agricultural Accident, and it's a brilliant recovery of the settler erasure of Aboriginal civilization based in landscape management as ecological rationality of so-called prehistoric people. And his quote, Aboriginal people are born of the earth and individuals within the clan are responsible for particular streams, grasslands, trees, crops, and animals. The life of the clan was devoted to continuance. Now, while this life form is devoted to continuance or was devoted to continuance, capitalist modernity is devoted to discontinuance. Here I would counterpose the temporalities of nature and capital, the one cyclical and reproductive, and the other linear and destructive. This, I argue, is exemplified in contemporary agro-technological fetishism, which works largely to cover capital's misguided tracks. For example, new herbicides to contain superweeds, or precision or digital agriculture to reduce environmental damage integral to industrial agriculture. These are external private technical applications. They are represented as innovations, which of course they are phenomenally, but with a sordid history, driven by capital accumulation. And their mission is to displace ongoing shared experimentation of extant farming cultures justified by the accumulation lock-in imperative. It's not surprising then that the 2019 high-level panel of expert report in the UN Committee on World Food Security on agriculture was entitled Agroecology and Other Innovative Approaches. That is, agroecology is considered simply as another tool in the toolbox, rather than a holistic and socio-political technology in its own right. Worse, it is associated with the past, that is, life worlds that have no business being practiced today. Thus, when the report was released in Rome, the US ambassador to the FAO, Kip Thom, railed against the CFS report, claiming that such a policy recommendation, quote, did not share the basic values and core assumptions on which we operate here in the United States, and is an explicit rejection of the very idea of progress. So to conclude, it is ironic that the destruction visited on non-European cultures historically is now universalized, so that the socio-ecological effects of assault on so-called people without history in the past are now being visited upon the people with history, but not without reactive intensification of that centuries-old violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. That's a great ending slide. It's tough to beat that. And thank you so much for the presentation.
Okay.
If we could come off, great, terrific, thank you. And we're going to move on now to Judite Stronzake, who's professor of education at the Universidade Federal de Grão-Dourados in Brazil.
E dizer também que, começar dizendo assim, que no Brasil, hoje em dia, a gente é o país onde tem maior óbitos por Covid-19. Estão morrendo, em média, 5.000 pessoas por dia. 366 mil pessoas. E na maioria das vezes, são mortes evitáveis. A expectativa de vida de 77 anos passou para 75 anos. E os óbitos, em função da Covid, em sua maior parte, são jovens e são evitáveis. Então, assim, o Brasil hoje corresponde a 2,7% de população no mundo, mas concentra 37% de óbitos. Então, são óbitos mais do que Europa, Ásia, África, Oceania e toda a região das Américas. Então, para nós, um dos grandes responsáveis dessa pandemia e desse pandemônio que estamos vivendo, esse genocídio, é o agronegócio, né, como um mal que existe na nossa sociedade. Então, para o capitalismo, quando o capital entra em crise, né, faz essa fusão do capital financeiro internacional, das empresas transnacionais e dos fazendeiros. Então, isso dá todo esse poder e essa potência ao agronegócio. O ano passado, enquanto o país todo, o Brasil todo, teve uma queda do PIB de 4,1%, o agronegócio, com as exportações de commodities, subiu 24,31%. Então, esses são dados das instituições que acompanham esse desenvolvimento da economia a nível nacional. Ao mesmo tempo que tem um aumento das terras cultivadas para o agronegócio, das commodities, há uma redução do cultivo de comida, do tipo, reduziu a produção de feijão, reduziu 23% da terra cultivada. Em contrapartida, o preço do feijão, que é a base da nossa comida, do nosso prato de todo dia do feijão, subiu o preço do feijão para o consumidor 40%. A terra cultivada em arroz reduziu 50% e o preço do arroz subiu 69,5%. Então, isso, assim, essa expansão, essa fusão do capital financeiro internacional, das empresas transnacionais, dos fazendeiros e o agronegócio, tem um apoio e um subsídio do Estado Nacional, que financia e que apoia. Uma segunda questão que tem a ver com esse avanço e essa expansão do agronegócio é que o capital, né, para sair da sua crise internacional, busca nas terras cultiváveis, na água, nas matas, nos bosques, nos recursos naturais, na mineração, busca sair da sua crise através do uso e da apropriação e da expropriação dos recursos naturais. E então, com isso, nós temos um aumento de fome e de doença. No Brasil, 19 milhões de pessoas não têm o que comer todos os dias. Então, isso é um dado assim, assustador, né, da fome. 116 milhões de pessoas convivem com a insegurança alimentar, não sabe se vai ter comida hoje ou não, ou se tem pouca, e 43,4% não tem a comida suficiente, com os nutrientes suficientes todo dia. Então, aqui nós estamos vivendo uma crise de saúde, né, uma crise sanitária com a Covid-19 e uma crise do aumento da fome. Então, a fome de volta na nossa sociedade. E isso tem a ver, né, com essa crise do capital e essa junção das empresas do capital financeiro internacional e na expansão da produção de commodities. Aumenta a concentração de terra, onde que 1% dos proprietários detém 47,6% de todas as terras, ou seja, é quase a metade do mapa do país, que está na mão de 1% de grandes produtores de commodities. E então, com isso, nós temos uma redução do cultivo, né, do cultivo de comida. Então, 65,4 milhões de hectares de terra é destinado para a produção, especialmente de soja, milho, cana-de-açúcar, do etanol. Então, assim, uma redução da produção de comida para amenizar a fome e um aumento da produção de terras disponíveis para a produção de commodities. Uma outra questão que também, rapidamente, vamos chamar a atenção, é que as principais empresas que estão nessa produção do agronegócio, das commodities, a Cargill, Bunge, ADM e a Dreyfus. Então, essas grandes corporações transnacionais é que dominam o cultivo das terras no país. E ao expandir o agronegócio, também se expande o cultivo das sementes transgênicas. E ao usar, né, semente transgênica, também aumenta o uso intensivo dos agroquímicos, dos venenos. Então, nosso país usa 20%, né, dos venenos do mundo, 20% desses venenos, desses agroquímicos estão aqui no Brasil. Né? É o primeiro país no mundo que faz a importação dos agrotóxicos. Né? E aí, então, isso também tem a ver com aumento, né, nessa pandemia, agronegócio, fome, com aumento das pessoas malnutridas, né, aumento da obesidade, da pressão alta e situações de cardiopatas do coração. Então, um aumento da concentração da terra, da renda e da riqueza. Os dados da semana passada da revista Forbes dizem que no Brasil, na pandemia, aumentou, né, aumentou para 65 pessoas que são os mais ricos. Né? E esses mais ricos detêm aproximadamente 1,2 trilhão de dólares. Né? Então, um aumento, né? Ao mesmo tempo que aumenta as pessoas passando fome, né? Aumenta também, né, esse índice de desnutrição e aumenta o índice, né, o número dos mais ricos do país. Então, isso chama atenção. E também, né, com essa crise, né, do capital financeiro, esse avanço do agronegócio, o número de desempregados tem aumentado. Então, hoje nós temos já quase chegando uma cifra de quase 15%, 14,2%, ou seja, 4,3 milhões de pessoas que estão desempregadas. Né? E aí, então, com isso, aumenta a desigualdade social, aumenta o desemprego. E aí, então, nós temos um avanço aqui na sociedade, no Brasil, do que nós estamos chamando do avanço de um sistema genocida, aonde que o não combate a pandemia é uma decisão federal do governo. Então, o avanço do negacionismo, uma derrota da ciência. E aí, então, o que nós temos aqui na foto? O avanço do deserto verde, né, da fome, da Covid. Né? Então, essa foto é muito significativa do que nós temos. Então, soja, milho e cana. E, ao mesmo tempo, e aí já vou terminando, porque está dando meu tempo, o que o MST tem feito, então, nessa pandemia? O MST, enquanto movimento social de sem terra, de camponeses, né, defende a vacina imediata. Então, nós estamos em campanha para parar o país de 17 de abril, de amanhã até dia 30 de abril. Já foram doados 5.000 toneladas de comida e 1 milhão de marmita doada às pessoas que estão passando fome. Então, em contrapartida, né, a esse avanço do agronegócio, a nossa proposta é a ocupação da terra e a produção de comida da soberania alimentar, através da agroecologia. Muito obrigada do tempo e disponível para as questões que possam ser feitas.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. As everybody can see, the technology works, but only partially sometimes. So thank you so much for the presentation, Judite, and also for everybody trying to hang on and for the interpretation. So we try to make it work as best we can. Okay, next we have Sharad Chari, who's an associate professor of geography at Cal Berkeley.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Wendy and your team. While the rest of us are just barely trying to keep it going, you've organized the conference of this scale and seriousness with a background paper. Who does that anymore? Background paper, a serious introduction that lays out your intentions with great clarity. I really appreciate all of that. I'm not a scholar of plantations, but I realized at some point that my research in South Africa was framed by the aftermath of plantation labor. I'll lay that out in digest form in a minute. I want to keep a few threads in mind. First, the wonderfully honest footnote 5 in Wendy's paper, a point I share with her, that thinking with the plantation forced her to dwell on the effects of racialized enslavement, or as Nancy Peluso put it, how violence unfolds. And I would add, along with Sarah and Andrew, that this forces us to take seriously Black and subaltern thought, not just action, but thought emerging from struggles to end this orgy of violence. Second, I'd like to hold on to Tanya Lee's insight on the corporate mandate, unchecked, but with some limits we ought to grapple with. And Shalmali Guttal picked up on this in the last panel. Okay, I have a very ambiguous title, as you say. The session is called Uncertainty, and I couldn't get myself to say another post-plantation future is possible, but you can end that as you like. I want to begin with this very ambiguous photograph dated 1880 to 1900. It stages Durban Harbor, Durban, Indian Ocean port city in South Africa, through a dramatic curtain of banana trees imposed, as the caption dryly admits. This is more than just an idealization of a jungled tropical periphery opening up to boats gently rocking on a placid bay. The theatrical curtain indexes plantations surrounding Durban, toiled by indentured labor. The Black woman leaning in the bottom of the frame appears to glare back at the photographer, so painstakingly constructing this montage in the darkroom. In his last book, Cedric Robinson turned his attention to what he called forgeries of memory and meaning, like this one, that dissimulate the process in which, in his words, racial regimes tend to wear thin over time. In our time of widespread disintegration of capitalist certitudes about regular work accumulation, personhood, relations with nature, many other things, we might say more generally that capitalist geographies also wear thin over time. The heat of the South African War of 1899 to 1902, the time of this photograph, was witnessed to many such yearnings for certitude in the wake of widespread imperial uncertainty. So what were the uncertainties that lay ahead in what Ruthie Gilmore calls the long, murderous 20th century? So my thoughts here are just fragments of a long-term research conducted between 2002 and 2012, project called Apartheid Remains that looks at the remains of a century of racial capitalist segregation and struggle, centered on changing place that becomes these neighborhoods next to oil refineries, in this beautiful photograph by Cedric Nunn. But I want to stay with the early 20th century and with other forgeries of official discourse in the early century. City Hall was obsessed with the Indian, Gujarati, Hindu, and Muslim mercantile presence in the center of the city. And it was obsessed with these beautiful Art Deco facades that persist, the biggest mosque in the Southern Hemisphere at a particular time, because it disrupted a fantasy, a racial fantasy of a white city on the Indian Ocean in Southern Africa. But what escaped the city's racial way of seeing and not seeing was a slow and steady transformation of space, a deliberate transformation of space in the peripheries and interstices of the city, the kind of background of the foreground of this image, actually where we are, all of us, looking at this photograph. What the city couldn't see, the city looked south of the port and harbor at a place that was the flatlands in a city of hills. marshlands, but it looked at these places as a prized location for industrialization expansion across along the port. But what it didn't see was these lands were already being slowly worked and transformed by subaltern denizens who were effectively building another city in the rural urban peripheries and interstices. And they were doing so through forms of subaltern spatial praxis emerging from the plantation past. Now, to make this long story short, I'm going to turn to another forgery from, this is now from 1952, the moment of transition to apartheid. And these are maps from the Durban Housing Survey, topographic maps that rely on a cartographic vision that also discloses and effaces a lived world in the peripheries and interstices. And the only thing I want you to see here are these funny things called Indian gardens all over the place. They're all over these maps. And again, this is another work of subalternization. It both discloses and effaces practices on the ground. The indentured labor system had moved a mass of 150,000 people from certain parts of South Asia, and has a complex and long story to be told. But what various contemporaries start noticing is that people are coming out of indenture and turning waste and unproductive land into gardens planted with vegetables, tobacco, maize, fruit trees, and so on. Some Africans in mission reserves see these with some consternation as a kind of colonization of a different kind. But what is happening, and on the basis of this, you see a transformation, a planting of Indian fruit and vegetables across the city, and an entirely new kind of geography emerging in the interstices, marketing, and the fruit of their labor literally are all over the city. There's a kind of Whig history, a botanical history of Durban, which focuses on the botanical gardens, the relationship to Kew and so on, circulation of imperial botanical knowledge, and it completely avoids what Judy Carney calls the botanical gardens of the dispossessed. And in fact, all across Durban, the evidence of this kind of rooting in space is evident. And while they were rooting these, planting these fruit and vegetables and so on, and building kind of, the space of marketing, which was crucial for the city. White people loathed this, but they also the white city relied on cheap fruit and vegetable marketed by this labor. Okay, on the basis of this transformation of space, there's an entire world of all the farmers, Hindu and Muslim farmers engage in syncretic practices. Reformers come from South Asia early in the 20th century to stamp them out and make them good Hindus and good Muslims. They fail and they leave, and they become much more committed to a eugenic nationalism focused on the territory called India, and they leave their diasporas behind. And these diasporas now are interconnected, and they've built the spatial integument of a new kind of social life. And one victory was this farmers market in the middle of the city, and a whole series of farmers markets across the town, which persist in today. At the center of Durban is a covered informal market, a great victory for the working class and for Black women who transact at the center of the city. Nothing like the fantasy of a white city, and that's the great story. Is that this kind of undermining of the white city. But and I just want to kind of point to this little site. It's a poignant event that clarifies. Thanks, Eric. A collective sacralization of Indian settlement, a grave of an unknown indentured Indian, retrospectively recast as the remains of a wandering Sufi mystic, to situate an emplaced saint crucial to the cosmology of South Asian Islam and Durban's shores, and that this shrine of Badshah Pir continues to be central to Muslim Durban. It's also a silent tribute to an unknown indentured labor at the heart of a bustling city. Now, what do we make of this? And this kind of takes me to some of the politics that Tanya Lee brought up yesterday. That, what are the what's the political aftermath of this? It's diverse. I think we should be cautious about the idea of a plantation logic, because we have multiple possibilities emerging from this. But one thing that does happen, I call this a kind of successful marronage in a certain way. The slate plot writ large across the city, but it's racialized, and it's ethno-racial subjectivation can go in very different ways. It does, in fact, become the grounds of a crucial aspect of the coalitional Black politics emerging in the 1970s and 80s, crucial to the end of apartheid. So there is a kind of militant aspect. It is repurposed as the infrastructure for abolition, and I think that's very important. So I'd like to think that, at the end, I'd like to say we should be cautious about an all-encompassing plantation logic. I would resist that move. I would also, however, ask that we reckon with what happens around the edges of the racialized corporate mandate, perhaps unbeknownst to it. And to discern this, we need to expand our engagement with Black and subaltern archives and political imaginations. Thank you. I'm trying to end this. There you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharad. That was terrific, and really a very kind of emotional way to end with that monument. Having spent some time in Durban, it's really an incredible thing, I think, to end with that image. Our last presenter will have 10 minutes with Michael Watts, who's Chancellor's Professor of Geography Emeritus and Co-Director of Development Studies at Cal Berkeley, and then we'll open things to discussion. Michael.
Thank you, Eric. 10 minutes with me is always too much in my experience. Thank you, Wendy, for organizing this transnational Zoomathon, quite a remarkable event. I hope everyone is safe and well. I'm here largely under false pretenses because, to the best of my knowledge, I've never written anything about plantations. I'm not a plantation scholar. Indeed, I can barely pronounce the word plantation. I've seen. There's a lot of vowels there. Of course, ignorance has never stopped an academic from sallying forth and talking about the way of the world, and I'm going to continue in that noble tradition today. Though my ignorance in this particular case is rooted in part in my own research experience. The parts of the world that I've studied at length, West Africa, Nigeria in particular, are marked in part by the relative insignificance of the plantation, understood narrowly as a form of production. Of course, there are current and existing forms of tree plantations. There's a history of state-owned oil palm plantations, most of which have collapsed under their own weight. There's a very limited agro-industrial presence in the country, and the colonial state itself actively resisted corporate plantations. I don't mean to infer in any way that the more expansive sense of the plantation scene, including those sorts of properties that Wendy documents, monoculture, regimentation of production, etc., aren't obviously and haven't shaped the Nigerian world. But I guess what I would conclude from this as a starting point are three things. One, the geographical planetary unevenness of the plantation form. Secondly, the fact that sources of resistance to the plantation come just not from below, but also from other fractions of, or can, from other fractions of capital, from particular political configurations, from nationalist sentiment. And third, there's a deep and long history of plantations collapsing under their own weight. What strikes me of so much about the global land grab work is precisely that phenomena. I was going to show you a remarkable video of exactly such a collapse in contemporary Nigeria, one part tragedy, one part farce. But the point is that those three things for me, which are perhaps worth reflecting upon. Okay, what am I going to do in my 8 minutes here? I'm going to depart from script a little bit, if you don't mind. I want to engage with Wendy's paper. She did not write this as a canonical text, but it's chock full of fantastic provocations. And I'd like to reflect upon those if I can. I'm going to do that by flagging a number of things, and I'll just pass over them quickly that I think we need to think about very carefully. And then I'm going to focus in on three that particularly interest me. Okay, so just some flags and things. The question of, let's call it the socialist plantation complex. What's its genealogy? Where do we derive that from? Is it derivable from a source of scientism? Do we need to turn to a type of Frankfurt school of argument about a deeper Western sense of technological hubris, domination of nature? But is it wrapped up actually with a set of Soviet commitments seen in Lenin and Trotsky's fascination, obsession actually, with industrial Fordism and the like? Or is it connected in some way to Russian landed estates? What of Maoism? What about the export of those Eastern European models of socialist plantation worlds that we see in parts of Africa, for example? What is the nature of this socialist plantation dream world? Secondly, I was going to talk and rant on a little bit about the notion of plantation logics, but Sharad did that. I think we have to be careful here. There are multiple and contradictory logics at work. Question of how plantations travel. This is the language, again, that Wendy uses, and she uses the language of replication. I'm just posing as a question, is that, that's one way to think about it, but replication often implies a template or an imprint. And given these multiple logics, I wonder if that's quite right. Questions of control and occupation that Tanya spoke about and so on. These are clearly quite central to the labor process. I just want to flag the fact that plantations have done, of course, a lot of other work. Think of the Irish plantations in the 16th and 17th century. They were instruments to put down rebellion, 1, 2, as forms of political retribution, 3, as processes of Anglicization, in addition to being instruments of land seizure and racialized land seizure and colonization. Couple more things that I'm going to pass over quickly. The plantation as discourse. All I would say is that sounds absolutely right to me, but it needs to be held in tension with another dream world. Think of the dream world of the smallholder, an enormously powerful set of discursive realms with their own forms of sociology and imperative. And I think we need to keep those two in play. Wendy also mentions the word extraction. And here I'm just going to flag something that I did intend to talk about. There's some interesting parallels here between Plantationocene and the work, I'm thinking of people like Martin Arboleda, Mazen Laben, on the planetary mind and extended extraction. There's a conversation there waiting to happen. And last but not least, there's the question of how we think about the legacies of the Plantationocene or the plantation as form. Wendy uses the terms the echoes of the plantation. Lovely word, reverberations, but I wonder whether in her piece or when we think about it, we move too quickly from 16th century plantation life in Brazil to the export processing zone, the millennium village, the collective farm. For me, that has to be demonstrated. Otherwise, it's simply history by association. So let me focus finally in my couple of minutes on 3 questions that particularly interest me. First, and we can start with the definition of the plantation that Wendy offered, which is terrific, and its temporal qualities. It's an era. Perhaps worth reflecting on the fact that Francis Bacon, I went back and read his essay, fabulous essay from the 1500s on the plantation, extraordinary piece of writing, which of course has its own echoes of the Roman plantation, the plantations, the colonia of the Principate, which were not just military, but were agricultural and involved estate-based slave production of mass commodities, grain, wine, and oil. And that poses the question for me. Walter Scheidel, the great classicist at Stanford, who writes books that are typically never less than 800 pages long, has a fantastic account of Roman slavery. He points out there were 200 million slaves, not as a single unified system, but as what he called a system of slaveries. It's of course different from Caribbean and US South slavery. It was an open as opposed to a closed system. Slaves were used in a variety of purposes. There were possibilities for manumission that did not exist in the same way elsewhere. But he, and I'm thinking also of, thank you, of Jairus Banerjee's work, they have no problem talking about slave capitalism. So therefore, my question is, where do we begin our Plantationocene story? Question one. Question two. For me, plantationism, more than anything else, is about the centrality of a plantation as world making in which the worlds are made in relationship to racial capitalism and empire. And that locates, as Sharad was saying, plantation is seen in relationship to the Black radical tradition. C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, Cedric Robinson, Du Bois, and so on. And flagging it in that way, it seems to me, exposes two things. On the one hand, the fact that the classical agrarian question has typically not addressed precisely those racialized processes. Of course, we could see in Lenin, it talks about comparing the US South and Russia in a certain way. Max Weber talked about similar questions in regard to the Juncker path, as he called it, but generally it's an absence. And that flags for me the fact that from a Marxist perspective, we need to start, as Marx said, with the commodity as a cell form of capitalism, but that cell form is in fact the slave. And that implies to me that one thing we could be thinking about as a legacy of the plantation in the contemporary period is the whole category of unfree labor in its contemporary forms. Finally, let me read you this. This is a quote from James Oakes in a recent article in the International Labor and Working Class History Journal. He says, for that matter, he's talking about the US South. For that matter, are plantations a distraction? Over the centuries, Southern plantations relied upon various forms of labor, indentured servitude, sharecropping, slavery, etc. What distinguished slavery as a labor system was the fact that the workers were the movable property of the masters. It may be then the best place to get at the beating heart of the slave economy is not the big house at the center of the cotton plantation, but the auction house at the center of the domestic slave trade. Like collateralized debt obligations, a hodgepodge of loans on land, slaves, properties were bundled into bonds that were sold through bearings of London. What do I conclude finally from that? It seems to me that one of the powerful legacies of that insight is that the plantation scene needs to particularly address, in a sense, the question of commodity trade, the intersection of merchant capital, finance, and infrastructures. This is central, of course, to Mazadra and Nielsen's book, The Policy of Operations. But for me, and I was struck by Judith's paper where she referred to Dreyfus and Cargill, in the contemporary moment of the plantation scene, maybe we need to focus much more on the likes of Glencore, Mercuria, Koch brothers, the investment banks, offshore financial centers, which are so central to the contemporary operations of the plantation scene. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. This was a fantastic panel. I mean, really terrific the way these papers fit together, really inspiring. And I think it really goes some way to get to those three main questions I posed at the beginning about where does the plantation scene fit in terms of all these scenes? Also, what are the structures of dispossession? And finally, how does capitalism drive the plantation scene as an idea in the past, the present, and the future? I think this panel actually goes some way toward trying to answer all three of those at the same time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up things. I have two general questions that came in first. So if you're thinking about asking a question, please do put your hand up electronically, and we'll try to get to you. But let's start with a couple of general questions that look like a number of the people on the panel might be able to answer. So I've been collecting these and copying and pasting them into a document. So let's start with this first one by Haider Khan, who asks, is there a global political economy aspect to the adaptation regime that constrains the discourses and policy space in vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, but I think this could be applied anywhere in the global South? When I was advising the Secretary General of UNCTAD in Geneva, I saw this from close at hand. How do we analyze this deeply and find solidaristic discourses and solutions? So why don't we pose that to the panel and see if there's anybody. That was a question that came in after Kasia's presentation. So Kasia, do you want to start? And then we can see if anybody else on the panel wants to try to answer it as well.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I would be thrilled to hear if other people have thoughts on the answer to that question. But Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would love to hear more about your experience in Geneva, but the way that I think about what the adaptation regime is absolutely constituted through a global political economy. And so I think that the processes that are happening in Bangladesh are, as I said, both consummately local and also absolutely global. Bangladesh is not a sort of unique case, but it's a node in a broader global political economy. So I think the sort of ways that Bangladesh is used in this global imaginary of what needs to happen, to respond to this changing climate, is not something that's been generated just within Bangladesh by Bangladeshis, although obviously they've participated in it, but it is something that has sort of been participated in by a lot of different global actors who are situated in many different spaces.
Yeah, and I want to open this to others on the panel. I don't know, Andrew and Sarah, if you want to try to answer this for kind of indigenous spaces in the American Southwest or any place else.
I'll wait for the next question. I don't know if ours fits very well. Thanks. So.
Okay. Would anybody else on the panel like to try to answer this question, or I can move on to a new question? Okay. In that case, let's move forward. We have another kind of general question from Masha Guganik. Agroecology as one tool next to the others. For example, digital agriculture is a growing trend in agriculture policymaking, and for example, also in the EU. Concurrently, many farmers do not think in such stark anti-pro-technology ways in their agriculture practice. What would be a way of combining these approaches without perpetuating well-known inequalities and power imbalances inherent to such digital technologies, or should one not engage with them at all? That is a tough question. Any takers for that from our panel?
Well, Eric, I responded to Masha in the chat and made the point that one can see agroecology and industrial agriculture as a binary or a dichotomous set of practices, but also this notion of agroecology as being one tool in the toolbox, which I think is used by the powers that be. I mean, in fact, that's what Kip Thom was saying in Rome in 2019, where I was listening to his response to the release of the report on agroecology by the high-level panel. And I think that's a trivialization of agroecology because it's quite distinctive. As many of us know, it's a holistic technology. It's not the addition of this or that technologies, I would argue, covering tracks that industrial agriculture has already made. So that's one way of responding to it. The other way of responding to it is that it's very well known now that there are many farmers, particularly middle-sized farmers, family farmers, who are beginning to adopt agroecological methods, not wholly necessarily, but iteratively, in part because it's too expensive to farm industrially now because of the concentration of corporations that supply seeds and fertilizer, agrochemicals, etc. And furthermore, they're recognizing that they're destroying their land base. And in fact, the recent book by Tom Philpott called Precarious Bounty, which is a brilliant study of the undermining of Californian and Midwestern soils, makes the point that when the settlers first came, there were 16 inches of topsoil in the Midwest. Now 50% of that topsoil is gone, and it continues. So his point is, as his book points out, that there are a lot of middle-sized farmers now who are beginning to retreat from purchasing agro inputs and rather to nurture their ecological wealth, so to speak. And this is very much along the lines of what Jan Dahl van der Ploeg talks about when he talks about repeasantization, which has been very prominent in Europe. I had a grad student, Elisa Davia, who did a wonderful dissertation on the way in which small, middle-sized farmers in Europe operate under the radar and share seeds, which is illegal in Europe. But because they're informal, they're off the radar, they're not counted. But in fact, as Jan Dahl told me, they produce much more food in Europe than agribusiness does. So it's a very extensive culture, so to speak, but it's totally invisibilized. And I think this is the big problem, that we need to document these kinds of experiments that are going on around the world and make it clear that they're successful in so many ways, and they actually, connect solidary economies in urban centers, which is what Elisa found with her work in Italy, Spain, and France, with farmers on the land, and so affect that kind of short supply connection, short supply chain connection between producers and consumers. So there's different ways of looking at it, and I'm not convinced that large scale industrial agriculture that's managed overseas, across huge distances where those managers have no relationship to the land. They're not even farmers. They have no knowledge, but they're just using technologies as alternatives, such as the new technologies to bring drones in to replace bees to pollinate plants, etc. This kind of stuff is accelerating, and it's very problematic, I think. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to move to two questions that came in for raised hands, and then I'm going to try to go after that to two questions that came in Portuguese. So I'm giving Wendy a heads up that she's going to interpret those two questions. Let me just give you the two names, because the only Portuguese word I know is obrigado, which I've been saying to Judite over and over again. But the two questions are from Diocelia Nascimento and Mariana Calgani, both in Portuguese. Maybe we could just get a quick translation of those. But first, let's go. They're high up in the chat for this panel. If Wendy, if you don't mind just saying what those are, that would be great. But we have two questions come in from raised hands. Rob Davenport first, and then Bikram Gill. So Rob Davenport, if we could, Gloria, if we could get Rob Davenport in so that he can ask his own question, that would be great. Thank you.
He's ready.
Can you hear? I'm fine. You can hear me? I'm going to ask the question in Portuguese, and then I'll quickly translate it into English to let Wendy off the hook. And then it's a question for Judith, but maybe tangentially, maybe for Wendy and Michael Watts. Well, Judith, muito obrigado pela sua apresentação. Muito obrigado. Eu estou no sul de Minas, eu estou sofrendo aqui no Brasil todos os dias, estamos sofrendo sobre esse governo imbécil. Além disso, a panorama do agronegócio é muito impactante, mas queria te perguntar sobre... Eu trabalho na Amazônia, no Pará, normalmente, e a questão é sobre a pecuária bovina, né? Outro setor que ainda também está crescendo no Brasil, nesse setor econômico, além da soja, milho, né? É a pecuária bovina. E como nós temos considerado tanto como a pecuária bovina como uma outra forma de plantação, o controle sobre terra, em conflito com a minifundiária, né? Como essa até a expansão da pecuária bovina na Amazônia brasileira, a destruição das florestas, territórios diversos aí, e conexão com o poder político. I'll ask it in English now. The question is basically, we've talked about the expansion of the agribusiness plant crops in Brazil, but the issue of cattle ranching is also the only sector of the economy that's still growing, of course, because of political moves to empower that sector, and the way that's connected to meatpacking in the United States. JBS, the company that is the largest global meat packer, is actually the owner of most of the meatpacking infrastructure in the United States. So the question is, I guess, more broadly, not just to Judith, but maybe to Michael Watts or Wendy, is just, I haven't been talking so much about animal plantations, maybe so far, maybe I've missed something from yesterday, but is the control of what was a sacred animal in India, and the way that the Nelore breed cattle are being used to occupy, an area the size of Western Europe, with no labor essentially. Is that fit into the plantation scheme scene? Anyway, that's the question. Two questions, I guess. Thanks.
So Eric is asking me to unmute. I'll set aside that last question because I have to admit I was writing down the questions in Portuguese, so I didn't totally catch it. Maybe it was addressed to Michael. Maybe Michael can answer it. So Dioselia's question was not a question, it was a comment about the good harvests that have been had in soy and corn over the past few years, and just how even as this model is being thrown into question, in part because of the sort of characteristics that Judite outlined with massive use of agrochemicals, et cetera, it's still going gangbusters. And so the question then was of market demand and how market demand is being really traced back to the US and to China. Then Francisco, who posed a question, posed a really good one that I think you can see in places where I've worked too, which is that in many contexts and plantations, you have people who are working, doing manual work who would be expelled if new technological innovations came in. Northeastern Brazil, it's a lot for 500 years. It's been basically the same hand labor. And so how do we think about the politics of innovation in those industries where it would mean not only shutting down the corporate aspects of these plantations, but also getting rid of the laborers? And then I just want to comment really quickly, and I guess throw it back to Michael, although I haven't had a really good chance to formulate it as a question. But in relation, the papers were all brilliant, and I really appreciated yours, Michael. And I actually agree with everything you said, but I see what you said as largely, to me, affirming the utility of the exercise of trying to understand exactly what are those differences, those particularities, and what are some of the both patterns and relationships between those different kinds of plantations in different places and moments. And I think a lot of the work that we do is precisely about trying to understand the very context specific, the very located and place-based nature of production, of all of these different forms of production, and the ways in which they're inserted into, embedded, and also shaped by the global or world market, right, if you will. So it isn't that they all need to look alike or be somehow of a kind, and I know that's not what you were saying, but that there's analytical purchase to understanding how and in what ways they are alike or do differ, right? So I think it's fascinating to me that socialism really cuts its teeth and then in some ways really falls apart based on the desire to turn what were a certain kind of set of estates into these collective, large-scale, massive farms that continue to have an impact on production and consumption and the nature of the state in the former Soviet Union and in China. So it is to say, it is to throw back the question to you, I guess, in a sense. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. I also put in the chat, I don't know if I can, should I just quickly say it here? I guess the question that I have is also in the chat is, first of all, thank you for the really, really wonderful presentations. It's an issue that I have also written quite a bit about recently, but my question is around, the Plantationocene, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, these framings, they seem to be urgently and quickly taking up the question of race, but they seem to come back to a category of nature or earth or geology, right? Like, we heard this in some of the presentations too, right? The need to counterpose the temporality of nature vis-a-vis the temporality of capital, right? And I'm wondering if we can, if presenters might be able to comment on the limitations of these categories if we consider how something like nature itself, its modern genealogy or geology, emerges through a racialized erasure of indigenous and Black in West Africa forms of landscape shaping, right? And the story of colonial capitalism is not simply erasure, which Phil pointed out really nicely in his presentation, but I think like Sharad points out, it's the story of appropriation too. And what's being appropriated is not simply nature, but indigenous earthworlding, right? Like the shape. So then the question of addressing the crisis becomes a question of, we can't look past this question of indigenous sovereignty, right? And really centering how landscapes are co-produced. And I worry that geology, nature, earth, so in my work, I use the category earth world, right? But I worry that these are become complicit in reproducing racialized appropriation erasure. So yeah, I'm just wondering if there might be any comments or thoughts on that. And it's also in the chat.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's open that up. Is there anybody on the panel that would like to, we have a couple of things out there now, so we could get maybe a couple of replies, especially from folks who haven't replied yet. That would be great, but anybody is fine.
I wasn't sure if Phil had his hand up and when to respond, and then I'll respond after.
Okay, I did have my hand up, and I'll make a quick comment, Bikram. Thanks for the question. I think that you're onto something there that's very important, and I think that I might have set your question off a little bit by juxtaposing, nature as being cyclical and capitalism as being linear. And I'd take that further and make the point, from the Aboriginal quote that I produced, and that is that the co-production is very much part of that cycle, and the co-production addresses and recognizes and reproduces the cyclical character of nature, even as it's being transformed across time. So, I mean, I think that's one way to look at it. And so your question, I think, is very appropriate. And as for the present, in terms of how we address the degradation of planet Earth, it's about restoration. In fact, Nicola Bullard made the point that I'm just quoting: "Does sustainability even make sense when there's so little left to sustain? Instead, we should be talking about regenerating and restoring what has been destroyed. Too much human imagination is channeled into solving problems the wrong way. What we lack is the imagination to think about how to live differently, etc." So I think that's a useful way of thinking about it also, that it's not just about living differently, it's also about restoring what has been destroyed. And my example, say, of the family farmers who are nurturing their ecological wealth instead of buying into commercial commodity inputs, is one example of that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Andrew and Sarah, if you wanted to go ahead and answer as well.
Yeah, I just want to say, Yat E Bikram, it's nice to meet you. Actually, Sarah and I have both read at least one of your papers, and we got a lot of insight from it. So it's great to actually have this way to meet on speaking on these topics, and to have a opportunity to be talking about the way that seeing renders nature, the way that the ideas of nature are brought in to then be enacted upon by, in the case that we're looking, state planners in Arizona, and the diversion of water from the Colorado River into the making of modern Phoenix and Tucson. And so getting, I guess, more to the center part of your question about how do we think about indigenous sovereignties and alternative formulations of time, I'll just put it much more simple. Oh, great, perfect time for my dog to bark. I'll put it more simply, and to say that I think that environmental group, like if we look at environmental groups that are indigenous and non-indigenous, we can see that indigenous environmental groups, especially like where I've done a lot of my research, are always harking back and looking toward traditional, what they define as traditional practices, recovering them, doing a kind of resurgence, and then enacting these kind of older forms of sovereignty that may or may not be recognized by the colonial state. And it's an interesting pairing with other kinds of environmental groups who are always future oriented, who are talking about like what Kasia talked about, you know, adaptation regimes, and about like how we're going to get to new technologies in the future. It's a really interesting difference to think about where these different kinds of environmental groups are thinking, you know, which direction of time they're looking at. So I think that's one way to kind of examine it. That question about, you know, what are indigenous futurities, and, you know, and it's like paraphrasing. Well, anyway, I'll just stop there.
Great. Sarah, did you want to reply anything?
No, just that I love the question. And one of the things that Andrew and I have been thinking about is the politics of bounding time itself, and the ways that that's tied to other kinds of colonial science of drawing boundaries between people, between spaces, between times. And is there really a way we can do that without ultimately kind of replicating the problems that we're trying to address? So we think about that here too, with the ways that people have been racialized as not quite human, and the way that Black studies scholars, and I'm thinking especially of a recent book by Jackson, Becoming Human, the way that they're questioning what do we do with the connection between like people, nature, the human, and how that itself already gets us into a whole mess of problems.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question here also for Judy.
Do you mind?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
Do you mind if I respond? Can I respond?
Please do.
I suppose that's you can't very well say, yes, I mind. All right, so I just wanted to very quickly respond to Bikram and also to Heather's question, which was just before that in the chat, and in relation to the point that Michael raised about thinking with the Black radical tradition, which is also Wendy's footnote 5. And just that from my perspective, I suppose I take the I answer as a kind of historical geographer, you know, with the kind of humility that the archives force and the archival limitations force on our forms of storytelling. And I think, you know, because otherwise we let our sort of theory run away from our capacity to tell a different story, which is the hard thing, actually. So, I mean, you know, Nancy Hunt does something with Bakhtinian laughter, which is quite interesting on thinking about, you know, Leopold's Congo. How do we valorize urban spatial praxis? How do we think about other forms of earth writing or earth world writing? You know, that question is already framed for us by the paradox of appropriation and erasure. The ways we tell stories about appropriation and erasure are already so powerfully shaped for us. And in some ways, that's sort of like something we can't get around. Michel Rolfe-Trio said this ages ago. We have, you know, that's crucial to our praxis, but this is part of our challenge, I think. And from Southern Africa, one of the exciting and interesting things is the kind of clash of, I think Southern Africa and its oceanic, the regions around it, the kind of multiple imperial trajectories intersecting, the multiple subaltern trajectories intertwined with them. They produce a kind of conjuncture in which it's impossible, I think, to get away with ontologizing the response and saying, you know, that and taking because that was already a colonial impulse. So, you know, that's why the kinds of storytelling I do, they're insurgent within the archival forms that I'm engaging with. Yeah, and just the last point on the question of how do we, you know, retool and read Black radical indigenous subaltern thought as part of our theoretical, you know, archive. Those questions are also complicated here in Southern Africa because the kind of charisma of the sort of Black American thought within what we think of as the Black Atlantic has overtaken other kinds of of the pathos in Durban, and I ended with that shrine, is that we don't have something like the Black radical tradition to think with in the Indian Ocean. Even though there are long histories of struggle, of suffering, of political imagination, and that confrontation is something that is still at the heart, I think, of the South African sort of post-apartheid problem.
Thank you so much, Sharad. I want to make sure there's at least two questions I want to just make sure we get in, and one is for Judite, and that is a question from Louise, who has asked, has the MST done an analysis of how much land would need to be in smallholder control in Brazil in order to feed the country? Can there be sufficient production and distribution efficiency? Are there any potential negative economic or ecological effects from such a proposal? And yeah, Judite, did you understand that? Did you see that question? It's a very short one. Yeah, do you see the question there? It's from Louise.
Não estou conseguindo ouvir. Aqui sim, agora sim. Qual que é a pergunta?
Eric, I can quickly do the question. Judite, a pergunta é se seria possível no Brasil de não ter empresas grandes de produção, mas de só ter produtores pequenos. Será que tem bastante terra que pode ser um futuro possível?
Então, a nossa situação aqui é um país continental com muitas extensões de terra. E desde do MST, nós temos, junto com outros movimentos sociais da Via Campesina, em especial o MST tem desenvolvido experiências de produção de comida. Então, tem dados oficiais do próprio governo que diz que quem põe a mesa, o pão na comida das pessoas, 70% do que se come vem da pequena propriedade. Então, 70% são os pequenos que produzem, os assentados, os sem terra, o pequeno produtor, as comunidades quilombolas de resistência, os indígenas. Então, é o pequeno que hoje já está dando mostra que é possível, sim, atender as demandas de produção de comida, 70%. O MST hoje é o maior produtor de arroz orgânico de todo o continente, de todas as Américas. Então, só nessa safra desse ano, foi mais de 12,4 mil toneladas de safra de arroz orgânico. Então, qual que é a questão? É transformar o conhecimento, a ciência, o avanço da tecnologia em benefício da humanidade. Então, hoje, o que a gente busca e defende é que nós não precisamos da Cargill, nós não precisamos da Bunge, não precisamos dessas grandes empresas transnacionais que vêm aqui roubar as terras do povo, contaminar com veneno, expulsar os indígenas, expulsar os pequenos produtores que vão encher as cidades que já estão cheias e se contaminar com Covid. Então, nós não precisamos dessas grandes transnacionais. Nós precisamos de um desenvolvimento nacional que atenda a soberania nacional através da produção de comida. E isso já está comprovado que é possível, desde as comunidades organizadas, em mutirão, em associações, em movimentos sociais, produzir essa soberania nacional. A respeito do gado vivo, que acho que foi o Rob, de Minas Gerais, que perguntou. Então, esse é um fenômeno novo aqui no Brasil, é a exportação do gado vivo em pé para os países centrais. Então, põe o gado vivo dentro dos navios e vai daqui para os grandes centros, para a Europa, para a China, para os Estados Unidos. E isso tem a ver com o avanço das queimadas na Amazônia, né? E no Pantanal. O Pantanal está em chamas, né? O Pantanal está em extinção, mais de 60 espécies. Então, põe fogo no Pantanal, põe fogo na Amazônia, para vir brotação nova, e aí então se põe gado em cima, que é uma carne especial, né, que é baseada nesses brotos que vêm depois da queimada, e expulsa os povos indígenas. Então é a volta da produção do gado e a soja no Pantanal e a soja na Amazônia. Então, assim, do ponto de vista da produção, é possível mudar a matriz produtiva desse país. Então, nós estamos, assim, passando fome e morrendo por causa dessa Covid. Obrigada, gente.
Okay, thank you so
Obrigada
much.
também
We actually have to stop now, but this was a fantastic panel. I'm really so grateful that all of you were able to come and speak. And we had a few slight technological problems, but still, even despite that, it was really incredibly good. And I learned an awful lot. I hope you did too. We're going to have a short break now before we go on to the next panel, but maybe we could all just give a round of applause for our panelists, virtual or otherwise. And thank you so much again. We'll see you in just a little while for the next panel.
Obrigada, Eugênia, da tradução, e a equipe de tradução, obrigada.